International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law Lectures. As all of you know, we organized these lectures because in the work that we do, we became sadly aware that although it took 60 years to develop the wonderful body of human rights and humanitarian law that we now have internationally and domestically in Canada, it seemed to be taking a much shorter time for governments around the world to dismantle that law in the name of security, particularly since September 11th, 2001. It was our belief, it is our belief, that significant enforcement of those bodies of law rests on public knowledge and education of the purpose of the laws and the public embracing them as part of their culture and insisting on enforcement. Under international law, Canada is obliged to have a policy and a program for educating the public, providing public education of international law, and we don't yet have, as far as we know yet, a policy, and we hope that this program that UBC has so wonderfully supported will be the beginning of a program in Canada. Now tonight I want to introduce you to our lecturer, Micheal Byers. Micheal Byers is a professor at UBC. He's the Canada Research Chair at the Liu Institute. I'm sure that most of you here are familiar with Micheal. He's written many, many books on international humanitarian law and on Canadian foreign policy. As a lawyer, I'm a retired lawyer actually at this point in time, but as a lawyer who's worked in the human rights field, I have to say that the legal academic community in Canada in this perilous time has been sadly disconnected from commenting on issues to the public. So I'd like you all to welcome Micheal Byers this evening. Thank you, Micheal.
Thank you. In January 2002, I had an encounter with something that became torture. In that that was the month when it became publicly known that the United States was taking prisoners from the battlefields of Afghanistan and moving them to Guantanamo Bay. And I was on sabbatical in England that year, back at Oxford. And when I heard that Donald Rumsfeld, the then Secretary of Defense of the United States, had peremptorily determined that none of these prisoners could be prisoners of war, I became quite angry. You see, I knew that Mr. Rumsfeld had just violated Article 5 of the Third Geneva Convention of 1949, which stipulates that if there is any doubt as to the status of someone who's apprehended on the battlefield, their status must be determined by a tribunal, a status determination tribunal, and not in a blanket manner by a Secretary of Defense. And when I get angry, I write. It's just my way of blowing off steam. And so I wrote a fairly angry op-ed explaining how Mr. Rumsfeld's decision was a violation of not just Article 5, but also of international human rights, and advanced the, at the time, somewhat lonely argument that people suspected of terrorism actually have human rights. And a lot came out of that, including thousands of emails, many of them quite hateful, some of them quite nice. I remember one of the nice ones. This is a little bit of a tangent, but it's a story worth telling. It was an email from someone who identified himself as an American veteran of the Vietnam War. He said, "Dear Sir, thank you for your article in The Guardian. I was a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. And my captors violated the Geneva Conventions in their treatment of me. But, sir, were it not for the Geneva Conventions, I am certain they would have killed me." And that quite clearly was something that Donald Rumsfeld could not or chose not to understand. And I'll come back to that point later, because how we as a country deal with the issue of torture isn't just about morality, it's not just about law, it's also about protecting our soldiers. Because it conditions how the enemy might treat them in the event that our boys or girls fall into enemy hands. The day that that article came out in The Guardian, I received a phone call from a journalist named Alan Freeman, who writes for the Globe and Mail and who at that time was based in London. And Alan's a fine journalist, and he didn't waste any time. And all he said was, "Is there a Canadian angle to this?" And I said, well, there could be, because the United States is now in violation of the Geneva Convention, and that means that under Article 12 of the same convention, were we to capture anyone on the battlefield in Afghanistan, we could not transfer them to American hands. Alan's story appeared on the Globe and Mail front page the next morning. I believe that afternoon, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was asked about this point during question period in the House of Commons. And his response, as I remember, was, "That's a hypothetical question." In other words, I don't need to answer that. Turned out that it wasn't so hypothetical. He'd been told it was hypothetical by his then Defense Minister, Art Eggleton. But Mr. Eggleton actually knew that Canadian soldiers in Afghanistan were capturing people on the battlefield already in January 2002 and transferring them to American hands. And this became public a couple of weeks later, thanks again to the Globe and Mail, which ran a photograph on its front page of prisoners being hustled out of the back of a helicopter in Afghanistan by soldiers in jungle green uniform. And every military expert who saw the photograph immediately went, "Hey, those are Canadian soldiers." Because American soldiers wouldn't be wearing green uniforms in one of the driest countries on earth. Our soldiers today are better equipped than they were in January 2002. But the point was that Mr. Chrétien had inadvertently misled the House of Commons, and not too surprisingly, it was only a matter of months before Mr. Eggleton was removed from his file, from his job as the Defense Minister of Canada. This story goes back. The story of the so-called detainees is now more than 6 years old. I'll come back to that shortly. But also in 2002, in the fall of 2002, a Canadian computer engineer was abducted while in transit at JFK Airport in New York and flown by the CIA to Jordan, where he was then driven to Syria and thrown into a hellhole of a prison, kept in a cell that was only 6 feet by 7 feet by 3 feet in dimension, and totally dark and damp, and occasionally taken out and tortured with an electric cable that was 2 inches thick, all the while not knowing what had happened to his wife and 2 young children, and wondering whether they might be somewhere else in that same prison, or perhaps who knows where. Now that Canadian citizen was, of course, Micheal Aurora. And I've got to know Micheal. He's the most remarkable of individuals. He's very strong. He's very brave. But he's got that same hollowness in his eyes. And what he went through and what his family went through is almost beyond our imagination. And I mention this most specifically because, thanks to the heroism of Mayor's wife, Monia Mazik, we all now know that Canadian officials were complicit in what happened to him. It's not just the Americans who are involved in this. It's not just the usual nasties, the Syrias, the Uzbekistans, the Zimbabwe's, the Chiles under Pinochet. It's actually much closer to home, especially over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. Now, in January 2002, when we were transferring prisoners to American hands, we were violating Article 12 of the Geneva Convention. But honestly, I didn't think that the Americans were going to torture those prisoners. Did anyone here actually think, okay, well, Gail's been around a little bit, just a few years longer than I have. But in January 2002, I still held out hope. I had met by that point, having lived in North Carolina for a couple of years and having been working on issues related to the military, I had met a lot of very professional U.S. military officers by January 2002. And I knew that they prided themselves on obeying the laws of war. I'd met a lot of the judge advocate generals and found them to be better international lawyers than most of my academic colleagues. And so in January 2002, Canada shouldn't have been doing this, but if you're going to violate Article 12, well, transfer them to the Americans and don't transfer them to Egypt or to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan I keep mentioning because in Uzbekistan they reportedly boil prisoners alive. They still don't do that in the United States, as far as I know. They just do waterboarding instead, which is pretty bad. It's definitely torture. John McCain calls it exquisite torture. And I don't recommend that you try it at home. But in January 2002, it seemed to be more of a technical violation rather than complicity in something more egregious like actual torture. But over the course of the next few years, the Aurora saga, the damning photographs from Abu Ghraib, the reports by credible news organizations like the New York Times and Washington Post concerning what was going on in Bagram Air Base, where Army medical doctors were actually reporting that prisoners had been murdered during detention and interrogation. When it all came out, those horrible photographs, Lindy England with an Iraqi man, almost certainly someone who was entitled to prisoner of war status on the end of a leash, And that prisoner with his arms extended and the hood over his head with the electrical cables dangling from his hands, standing on a box, being made to think that he was about to be electrocuted. I mean, all this had come out, and then as well those grossly unprofessional legal opinions supplied by politically appointed lawyers within the Bush administration seeking to justify torture, written by people like John Yoo, who still has tenure at the University of California at Berkeley. The body of evidence suggesting that the United States was violating torture in a systematic way had grown pretty significant by the summer of 2005. And I picked that particular date because it was in September 2005 that I discovered that Canada was still taking prisoners in Afghanistan and still transferring them to American hands. I know this because the next Chief of the Defense Staff, General Andrew Leslie, this is a prediction here, who will most likely replace Rick Hillier, had the honesty to actually tell journalists that at a press conference in Ottawa in September 2005. And I became angry again. Because, again, it's one thing to torture to people you don't, it's one thing to transfer to people you don't think will torture, and another thing to transfer when you know that they torture. I wrote an article in the Globe and Mail about this, pointing out how very illegal it was for Canada to be engaged in this behavior. And it was like a tree falling in a forest with no one around. I received absolutely no reaction to that article. Nothing. Usually I get tons of hate email when I do something like that, which is good because it means people are reading me. But there was nothing. And it wasn't until a couple of months later that I got the kind of feedback I was hoping for. And I had invited Bill Graham, who was then the defense minister, to come and to speak to one of my classes at UBC. And Bill was an international law professor for 10 years, and he likes to teach, and he's good at teaching. And he was coming to Vancouver, and there was a space in his schedule, and so he came and did this, and I'm very grateful for that. But of course, I also prep my students, right? I mean, he's still the defense minister, and they're still transferring, right, in violation of international law, and so my students asked him about this quite pointedly, and asked him about solutions, and said, well, why don't we, build a detention facility in Afghanistan so we don't have to transfer the prisoners to anyone? And the ridiculous response was, we can't afford to build a prison. So, sorry, Bill, but he's not here. But if you hear the podcast, Bill, we can't afford to violate human rights. And I'll talk about that again a little bit later. But at the end of the lecture, we were walking out, and Mrs. Graham was there as well, and she came up to me and said, you're the guy who wrote that article in the Globe and Mail a couple of months ago. I said, yeah. I said, that was me. And very quietly she said,